Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 324 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's episode is on what is chronic illness for psychologists. And it is Sunday the 25th of May 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is a lot of fun and it's really useful because this is also quite a personal episode for me, because whilst I talk more about this in the content part of today's episode, last week I was out with my partner and I saw firsthand how chronic illness can impact mental health, and that was quite interesting for me as an aspiring psychologist. But as a partner, as a loved one, it was a bit heartbreaking. It was really quite, not so much scary because it wasn't that bad, but it was really concerning to see how chronic health can suddenly make someone have a flare-up, have a turn, and that directly impacts their mental health, just they get more depressive symptoms. So I've had friends with a chronic illness before, and I've seen firsthand how it impacts them. For example, chronic fatigue syndrome, it can make you feel really exhausted, so you can't do much, and that can also make you more depressed. So there is a real link between chronic illness and mental health. But before I can ever start to understand that link in any sort of meaningful depth, I actually need to understand what chronic illness is, first of all. And there are areas of psychology where clinical psychologists specifically focus on people with chronic illnesses and using a psychological knowledge and psychological interventions to help those with physical conditions. So it's really interesting and you will learn a lot for sure. So you've got that to look forward to in the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society's Research Digest, and the first one is: code memories cue our bodies to warm up. Our brain uses associations to guide our bodily states. Anyone who has ever salivated at the sight of a slice of cake can attest to that. Such associations are vital to cueing day-to-day bodily functioning, beyond just preparing to eat though, as a new study illustrates. A recent paper by Andrea Mosfra and her colleagues published in Nature describes how mice that have learned to expect to become cold in a particular environment hike their metabolic rate, generating heat, when they're put back into that environment, even if it's actually warm. If the same thing happens in people, the team believes it could theoretically be possible to manipulate memories of temperature to help treat conditions which have significant metabolic components, including obesity and certain cancers. Okay, so there's a few things I want to say about this one, beyond the science that this is really cool, and this is actually quite on topic for today's podcast episode. And as always, I always find this quite funny when the psychology news articles actually match what's happening in the content part, because as I don't look at the psychology news section beforehand. So first of all, the first thing that I want to say is that who has ever salivated at the sight of a piece of a cake can attest to that. So yesterday I made a banana bread for my housemates because there were quite a few bananas, and because they're going away, I know the bananas are not going to be eaten, and I didn't want to throw them away. And banana bread is really nice. So I made the banana bread. They were really excited. My two housemates were really accelerating. They actually didn't want to have dinner. They actually just wanted to have the banana bread there, which was actually quite funny to see. So I definitely know that our brains do use associations to guide our bodily states. So that's one example. Another aspect which I find really good is that this is a great example of how to use psychological knowledge to treat physical conditions. So it would be interesting to see if it is theoretically possible to manipulate memories of temperature to help people who are obese and have certain cancers or any sort of other metabolic components. No, sorry, conditions with a metabolic components. But the one thing I will say about this study is this the classic argument of how well does animal psychology apply to humans. Of course, I understand that mice and other animals, especially great apes, have a lot of similarities with human physiology and psychology, but there's always going to be that gap. So I think that there does need to be a lot more experiments, a lot more research, seeing does this apply to a human? And once we understand if it applies to humans or not, that's when we can start to get to the really exciting stuff about can we actually manipulate memories of temperature. So, brilliant article, and I'm looking forward to the future. So, the second one is to make someone feel valued, flex your memory. Making someone feel valued can be tricky, especially if you're meeting them for the first time and only have a moment for a quick conversation. New research, however, suggests that there is one trick that can offer a shortcut to connection in such situations. The study in a question published earlier this year in the British Journal of Psychology, there was bringing up tidbits of information about your conversation partner that they've shared can quickly and easily convey how much you value them, even in a short exchange. The authors at the University of Aberdeen also observed that whilst this method is effective, we don't automatically use it as much as we could. Okay, so I know something that I always quite like to do is actually try and form connections as quickly as possible, especially if it's someone who I really want to talk to and I wouldn't mind seeing them again in the future. Especially if I'm like, oh, you're cool, you're interesting, I'd like to become friends with you. Of course, friendships don't happen automatically, but if you give someone a good first impression, then if you see them again, then they're more likely to want to talk at you again, and then you can start getting into those deeper conversations that can sort of promote and drive friendships. So this is actually a really valuable tip, which I'm definitely going to try in the future. But I understand that this is difficult and we don't automatically think about it because we was rereading this article. But then in that bringing up tidbits of information about your conversational partner that they've shared can quickly and easily convey how much you value them. Well, this is a little fraught because they've actually got to share information, and sometimes people don't share information. Of course, if you've heard about them, if you know bits and pieces about them from either previous conversations, previous engagements, or what you've heard from other people, then this is going to be really important and really valuable as a technique. But maybe that's something that we can all try this a week. I'm not sure I can because I'm actually going to have quite a little socially isolated week, which I'm actually quite looking forward to because it's half terms. I've not got any outreach work, so I don't have to see any students. I don't have to see any other ambassadors, and my housemates are away. So I'm going to go out and see some other friends, but I won't be able to try this technique too much this week. But maybe all of us should, just to test it out and see how effective it is. And always feel free to let me know about your results. And the last one is thinking outside the box and question everything. In a recent interview in the Psychologist, Dr. Lisa Orchard chats with her colleague, Professor Joanne Lloyd, ahead of her appearance at the British Psychological Society's Cyber Psychology Section annual conference in July. When asked for advice of a budding cyber psychologist, she had to share some broadly applicable wisdom. Open quote. In any kind of research, be critical and question some of the assumptions and things we are being sold by the media. We make assumptions about the consequences of technology use based on intuitive ideas about things or moral assumptions about the type of activities are a good use of time or a bad use of time. If we start from that point, we've already made our minds up. Then we're not going to have that critical research and not going to find out new things. So I hope the next cyber psychologists come aware of their assumptions, thinking outside the box and questioning everything. Close quote. And that's something that I've definitely learned over the past few years, especially from a clinical psychology point of view, because for me it is important that we do question everything, especially when we think we know the answer. And that's why research is important, because if you don't question stuff, if you think, right, this is a fact, this is a 100% fact, and I'm just going to take it for face value, then, to be honest, you are very much at a risk of getting flaws of results, because there's been lots of egg examples in psychology when we thought we knew something and we've been deadly sure that we've been certain of a particular fact, when it actually turns out that it was either a flux or a fluke of the results. This was a lot more common before the replication crisis, but by questioning, by wanting to explore new topics, new frontiers, that's how we expand our knowledge. That's how we get really interesting stuff, and that's where my love of psychology comes from. Because we're always learning, we're always experimenting, we're always pushing the boundaries forward of our knowledge. So, just something to think about. How could you question your assumptions, or at least be aware of them this week? So, I hope you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So, we're moving on to the personal update. This week, I would definitely say has been a week of endings. And partly that's a really good thing, and that's a really exciting thing, because it means that I'm getting closer to the end of my degree. I'm getting closer to the end of this chapter of my psychology journey. But it's also a little sad because this week I finished the reading support at a local school up in Medway, and I've also finished a breakfast club. Now, to me, breakfast club with these great students with dyslexia, autism, social anxiety, social emotional issues, etc. That was all really interesting, and that was so much fun every week because I got to bond up with these students. I got to talk to them, see them, and just help them with their everyday life, and just listen to them. And for some of these students, me talking to them and me listening to their life story, that was the first time that an adult, a stranger, had actually given them proper attention. Because sometimes they didn't have that back at home though, because of a wide range of different factors. So that's really interesting. But that's over now, so I'm never going to see these students again. Thankfully, even though I was 20 minutes late to Breakfast Club the other week because of horrific traffic, I was still able to say bye to quite a few students. So thankfully, I've been able to give them some closure, and I won't just be another adult who's popped in, formed a connection with, and then they never see them again without any explanation. So thankfully, I've managed to avoid the worst of that situation. But it's been a shame, to be honest, because reading support and breakfast club was such a big part of my life because I've been doing it twice a week, every week for the past 7 months. But it was very rewarding. I really did enjoy it. And then another example about how this was a week of endings was that one of my favourite ambassadors to work with. It was her last ever event, and I'm never going to work with her again. To be honest, I'm probably never going to go and see her again because she lives up in London. But I've got her, but I've got her Instagram, and I do fully intend to stay in contact with her. But it's a shame because we had brilliant conversations. She was just amazing. I really do enjoy talking and interacting with her. The reason why I'm telling you all of this is that it's okay to feel a little sad that something's ended. It's okay to feel that slightly negative emotion because it just shows how much you cared, how much you were invested in, and how interesting you found it, and foster that sense of it. It's not a bad thing. That actually just makes you a more brilliant person because it shows that you care, you're invested. And if you foster that sense for the future, and if you allow yourself to get invested in your work, then you're going to enjoy it more. And it reminds me of the whole philosophy of the 4 hour work a week. The whole idea behind that, from what I've heard, is that yes, you might work full time, but the most important thing is that if you love at your work and if you enjoy everything that you would do, chances are only 4 hours of it a week is actually going to be really dull work that you hate. So just something to think in mind this week. Plus, I also had a dissertation meeting with my supervisor. Now, I love my supervisor. She's amazing. She's brilliant. And we did our typical thing. I went into her office. We spent 10 minutes talking about why we were actually meeting. Then we spent another hour and 20 minutes talking about everything else, from politics to misogyny to research to students, etc. etc. It was a brilliant time. I really did enjoy it. I just didn't expect the meeting to go on for that long. But that's the fun of it. And that's what I love at university. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley, or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And please send pictures of where you're listening in from. I always love to see where all of you are from all over the world. And today's podcast episode has been sponsored by Working with Children and Young People, a guide to clinical psychology, mental health, and psychotherapy. Now, the reason why this is a brilliant sponsor for today's episode is because there's an entire section dedicated to this great, really easy to understand book towards how clinical psychologists can actually work with children and young people with physical conditions. And the section of the book is called Pediatric Psychology. It's really interesting, and I guess this is where my real passion for this area of psychology came from, because it was really good to see how not only do clinical psychologists work with other healthcare professionals like doctors, nurses, speech and language therapists, pain management, etc. But it's interesting to see, though, that all of our knowledge, all of our psychological knowledge about how does our perception of pain work, how does psychophysics Oh no, I'm not going to go on like a tangent about psychophysics, but psychophysics is so valuable when it comes to pain management because it's the physical sensations and it's our perception of those physical sensations that can actually really decrease our mental health, and it can actually help with our pain management. So there's so many brilliant, fascinating articles and so many little facts which will honestly make you go, wow, I didn't know psychology could do that. I didn't know that me, as an aspiring or qualified psychologist, could help people in that way. And honestly, it's amazing. I love this section of this book. And I really am looking forward to actually writing an entire book on clinical health psychology. Plus, I've also applied for some work experience because I really want to understand this field in a lot more depth. So I'm so excited about this, and I really do recommend that you pick up this brilliant, easy to understand, and really engaging book. So that is working with children and young people, a guide to clinical psychology, mental health, and psychotherapy. Available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, local library, or local bookstore if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, Barnes& Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Bacon Taylor, and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, because your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. So if you want to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, including early access to the blog posts for these podcast episodes, over 60 exclusive blog posts, which will be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years, knowing me, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. And if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can. Buy me at coffee.com/Connor Wiley. So that's enough of the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what is chronic illness for psychologists. But before we dive into it, I just want to say that I do apologise in advance if anything in this podcast episode is worded clumsily, because I am privileged enough not to have a chronic illness, so I don't have lived experience of these conditions, and everything based on this podcast episode is based on what I've read and witnessed and heard from my friends and my partner. So let's dive into it. What is chronic illness? So, chronic illness is when a person has a condition that lasts for at least a year and it requires ongoing medical care, or the condition consistently limits what a person can do on a daily basis. For example, chronic illness can include asthma, lung disease, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, drugs, chronic fatigue syndrome, amongst others. I've had friends with a chronic fatigue to be so exhausted and tired that all they can do all day is lie in bed. So this is an example of how a chronic condition can limit your daily activities. In addition, tens of millions of adults in the United States live with a chronic illness, and a lot of them actually have at least two chronic illnesses. And having a chronic illness typically requires you to undergo a lot of lifestyle changes that can be challenging and stressful. For example, with a chronic illness, you have to manage new diets, new exercise regimes, and a demanding checkup schedule, medication, limits on your social life, your work, and your travel. All of these challenges and stresses that can lead to anxiety, anger, and sometimes depression, and that's why I wanted to talk about chronic illness this week. From time to time in my clinical psychology lectures, I've heard about clinical psychologists working in medical settings to help people with chronic conditions like chronic pain. I've always thought that this was fascinating and interesting, but because I've been really busy, I've never thought about it that much, mainly due to my privilege that I do not have a chronic health condition, so I don't need to look into this area of psychology. Until last week. Last week, I was hanging out with my partner at our Dungeons and Dragons game that our friend runs, and there are normally a lot of us there. Afterwards, a few of us go out for dinner. Me and my partner spend the entire time talking, and we basically blank everyone else. And then we hang out afterwards, normally by talking outside their accommodation for 30 minutes. Even though, to be honest, and I didn't put this on the blog post, it's normally just meant to be a quick drop off, but then we get talking. Yeah, last week, dinner had finished early, and we didn't play board games like we normally do with our friendship group. So me and my partner began to hang out at mine until my partner's chronic pain and other chronic health conditions kicked in. Then they experienced loss of interest and pleasure, and their mental health just dropped. We still spoke for 30 minutes outside their accommodation until their joint pain made it unbearable. Just seeing and hearing how their chronic illness impacted their mental health made me sad, it affected me, and it made me really curious about this area of psychology. Therefore, before I can ever hope to understand how clinical psychology can be used to help those with chronic conditions, I actually need to understand what chronic illness is first of all. And that's what the rest of this podcast episode focuses on. Clinical psychologists help people cope with chronic illness. Whilst there are a lot of different ways how clinical psychologists work with those with a chronic illness, one way is coping with their new diagnosis. Since once people receive a diagnosis of their chronic illness, they often experience a lot of grief. They grieve for life loss and a future that will never go as they planned. For instance, if you're diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, then your dreams of being a runner, a sports player, or if your dream career in though doing lots of physical activity, like being a firefighter, that all seems impossible now. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Whatever the case, a diagnosis of a chronic illness involves a lot of grieving. In addition, people with a chronic illness have to go through a lot of mood changes, even in the day-to-day, because there will be times when they're fine and they're happy. Then their chronic illness might impact them, might stop them doing something, and this might make them anxious, angry, or depressed. This is because our moods can be very dependent on our options and your physical health. One of the reasons why my partner's mood fluctuates slightly at the moment is because they don't have any treatment options. They don't know exactly what they have, and their physical health is still really bad. This lack of physical health and treatment options has a negative impact on their mood. Clinical psychologists are useful here because research shows that when their clients directly tackle their diagnosis instead of avoiding it, and they seek help instead of retreating from the diagnosis, they experience better life satisfaction and undergo a healthier adjustment. This is why it's important to encourage clients with a chronic illness to become more empowered by asking their doctors questions about their diagnosis, treatment, and what this means for them. Psychologists can help clients by supporting them whilst they process their grief and undergo this transition period. Similar to what psychologists do in mental health interventions, they can help clients with chronic illness by reminding them to focus on what brings them joy and other aspects of behavioural activation. This can be as simple as committing to one small act of joy each day. Since clients can reduce their outside commitments and obligations to focus on the things that are more important to them personally, like spending time with their children or partner, and this can protect them against the stress of their diagnosis. Ultimately, when it comes to coping with a chronic illness, and this is definitely where clinical psychologists can be extremely useful, it's critical that clients remain positive despite their chronic illness, since researchers show people with a cancer diagnosis who remain resilient and positive were able to use professional counseling and social support to manage their chronic illness for years and decades. This meant that the clients were able to avoid rumination, accept their mortality, and take an active role in their physical health and treatment, all despite their cancer diagnosis. This positivity is the key to everything when dealing with a chronic illness. Some clients believe that their diagnosis changed them for the better too. At the time of writing, I'm currently reading I Haven't Been Entirely Honest with You by Miranda Hart, and it's a book about her diagnosis and healing from Lyme disease. It's a chronic health condition, so she hasn't been cured, but her outlook, her behavioural patterns, and her cognitive processes are at the core of the book. She writes about how her stress pot, her constant people pleasing, and wanting to be extremely productive because that's how she got her self-worth, all contributed to her physical health getting worse to the point where it almost killed her. She learned so much for herself because of her Lyme disease. And I highly recommend that you read that book if you want to have a deeper understanding of how mental health and what we think and feel and how we behave impact our physical health. Another aspect of this is that people with a chronic illness need to try and commit to staying positive, even if they find their mood decreasing because of their chronic illness, since people can become sick of being sick. This is where psychologists can be useful, because psychologists could help support a client whilst they support the client in acknowledging how they feel and allow themselves to be upset, reach out to supportive others, and challenge themselves to find positive aspects of their lives to help them regain a sense of control. Even though I don't have a chronic illness, this is why I found my rape and anorexia counseling so valuable. It both helped me to understand how to process my feelings, know that they are valid, and find the positive aspects in my life so I could feel in control again. Final aspect of coping with a chronic illness that I want to mention is how people with a chronic illness manage fatigue, since fatigue is a symptom of many chronic conditions, and this represents a massive challenge for people who face it. When this happens, a person with a chronic illness, and perhaps a psychologist could help them realize this, should try to move on from thoughts of an ideal day towards a more realistic one. They can listen to their body's cues as well as to become more flexible in the relationship with their body, so that they don't beat themselves up over their fatigue and how it impacts their daily life. Then, when they don't have fatigue, or when their fatigue impacts their life slightly less, then they could be able to embrace the moments that they can. For example, if you wanted to get a ton of work done today, and you wanted to go out in the evening to see your friends before hanging out with your partner at night, yet your fatigue makes the ideal day impossible, it would be about focusing on what you can do, being kind and self-compassionate, managing your health one day at a time, so that when you feel better and less fatigue, you can embrace the joyful moments that you want to. How does chronic illness impact mental health? So I wanted there to be a section in this podcast episode that explicitly explains how chronic illness impacts mental health. Therefore, chronic illness has a profound emotional and psychological impact on people because they can lead to a wide range of intense emotions like grief, sadness, anxiety, and frustration. Mainly, this comes from the life-altering nature of a diagnosis, and the diagnosis can make people feel hopeless about their lives as they no longer have a sense of control. Another side effect is that these feelings of hopelessness can exacerbate feelings of depression within people with a chronic illness, and psychologists can help because they can support clients through the grieving process and help them readjust to their new diagnosis. Another way how a chronic illness impacts mental health is through an increased risk of depression, since researchers show people with a chronic illness are at a high risk of developing depression, with people with diabetes being 2 to 3 times more likely to experience depression compared to people without diabetes. As you can imagine, psychologists can help clients deal with their feelings of depression. This is even more important when we learn that depression can complicate the management of chronic illnesses and typically lead to worse health outcomes and even an increased mortality rate. And the references are all at the bottom of the podcast episode. A final way how a chronic illness can impact mental health is through coping strategies and treatment, which touches on a lot of the points I mentioned above. This is why psychologists are needed so they can ensure a holistic treatment plan is developed and stuck to that addresses the client's physical and psychological needs. Psychologists can help people facing a future of illness. Unless you've ever met or you've had a chronic illness, then you might never have a thought about what the diagnosis of a chronic illness can mean to someone. Of course, there are benefits, like it means you can hopefully get access to the treatment options that will help them with their symptoms. However, a diagnosis also means a confirmation of everything that they feared. It means they actually have a chronic illness that is with them for the rest of their lives. So they face an uncertain future where their illness is always with them, and they need to learn how to cope and deal with that. As a result, finding support is critical after a diagnosis of chronic illness, and thankfully, there are support groups for many health conditions across the country, or there are online support groups too. Yet, whilst these support groups are critical because it means that you get to meet and talk with other people with the same condition as you, it is support and friends and family members that will be important to help the person cope with their chronic illness. Sharing news of a chronic illness diagnosis. One difficulty with a new chronic illness diagnosis is that it can be very scary to share the news with friends and family members. This is a deeply personal piece of information to share, and they're likely to be nervous, anxious, and concerned about how other people will react, because it fundamentally changes how others will see them. For example, whilst I don't have a chronic condition, there are some parallels with telling others that you're a rape survivor. To put this in the dating context, I wasn't sleeping, I felt sick, and I was scared that my partner was going to leave me if I told them that I was raped. Thankfully, they didn't, but it was a massive stressor that I did not need on top of everything else that I was dealing with at the time. Equally, people with a chronic illness don't want their friends and families to judge them for their chronic illness. Personally, whilst I know being raped and having chronic illness is not the same thing, but there will be times when their health means that they cannot do things, they cannot go outside, and they have to cancel plans with their friends. It's even more hurtful when your friends and family members, thankfully this is only the minority, do judge you and make comments. I think that this is similar to people with invisible chronic conditions, because there will always be silly people who believe you look fine, so you must be fine. Do not listen to those people. In reality, what I have found and what a lot of people with chronic illness I found too is that your friends and family members will be a lot more supportive than you ever thought possible. They will be able to and willing to offer help, but it's important that you establish clear boundaries too with them, so that your friends and family members know what aspects of your chronic illness that you are not comfortable talking about. In addition, some people with a chronic health conditions might feel fine most of the time, but then they might have episodes of illness or fatigue. This means that they might need to put brakes on plans or cancel things because they need to look after themselves. This is why it's important to be honest and open with friends and loved ones, according to the experts. It's better to be open about your needs for hands on and emotional support. You don't need to deal with your illness alone. It's okay to ask for help with shopping, cooking, rides to appointments, childcare, and so on. Psychologists are very useful at this point in the chronic illness process. Clinical psychologists can work with carers, clients, and their partners to come to terms with the chronic illness diagnosis. Psychologists can help the client to come to terms with the diagnosis, come up with a plan about how to tell others, and how to manage their life alongside the illness. What's the main challenge of living with a chronic illness for decades? This is even more important when we learn that the primary challenge of living with a chronic illness for decades is the uncertainty that it causes. A person with the chronic illness might never know when their symptoms will flare up, what treatments will work, and what job or career they're actually going to be able to do. This all takes an emotional toll on the person and leads to illness uncertainty. Illness uncertainty is the inability for a person to determine the meaning of illness-related events, and this makes the person experience unpredictability, ambiguity, deficient information, and complexity. From what I've seen from one of my friend's partners, she can be in a joint and talking, and having a perfectly normal day. Then her chronic health flares up. She cannot function. She has to lay down for hours and rest. Sometimes she can work out what caused it. There are times when she can't. It's very life limiting when this happens. And sometimes she made comments about that she would avoid going out, but she couldn't guarantee she couldn't have a flare up. How chronic illness can lead to changes in friendships. Another challenge of a chronic illness is that they can often find that their relationships with their close others change, and sometimes friends go missing, I say in air quotes. So their friends effectively ditch them, and it's common for people with a chronic illness to get angry, feeling let down by someone, and they blame themselves for friendships ending or changing because of their chronic illness. Yet when this happens, experts suggest it's more adaptive and healthier to recognize that relationships always change, and this rarely has anything to do with health. Changes in relationships are just a normal part of life, and this is why it's important to engage in self-compassion when relationships change. So clients aren't generating stories about why a friend has stopped contacting or talking to them that might not reflect the reality of what happened. Psychologists can be useful here in helping clients to navigate these social changes and learn how to express self-compassion. How does chronic illness impact young people? But ultimately, chronic illnesses can pose massive challenges for young people, like my partner and my best friend. Also, people might believe that because a young person acts or looks normal, whatever that means, I do not understand what that means, that it is impossible for them to have a chronic illness. Yet the young people with the chronic illness is likely to fixate and stress about their education. And this is one of the reasons why my best friend has struggled with university for years. How they're going to find a romantic partner, and how they're going to live a life where they have to watch everyone else do fun, cool things, but because of their chronic illness, they cannot take part. This is an aspect I remember very well from last August at the time of writing. Everyone else was out, going on holiday and doing cool things with partners and loved ones. My best friend was up in the Midlands with her family. My parents were doing knife making and so on. Meanwhile, I was stuck at home, alone, experiencing trauma reactions, unable to move, and I was experiencing a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. It made me feel even worse that I was trapped at home because of my health, and everyone else was living an amazing life in my eyes. People with a chronic illness experience similar feelings. This is where psychologists can be helpful, as they can support a person with a chronic illness. Can people with a chronic illness achieve post-traumatic growth? Finally, post-traumatic growth is one of my favourite psychological concepts, as I experienced this a lot after my rape. Yet people with a chronic illness might experience growth in 5 key areas proposed by Richard Zeke and Lawrence Calhoun. These key areas are seeing new possibilities, relating to others, finding personal strength, achieving appreciation of life, and experiencing spiritual change. Whilst experiencing growth in these areas are not universal, especially when it comes to chronic illness, sometimes these growth areas can be developed through therapy. Conclusion. After seeing how my partner's chronic illness impacted their mental health last week, I really wanted to learn more about chronic illness. And I know I have a long way to go before I can ever claim to remotely understand what it is like to have a chronic illness, let alone how it impacts their mental health. I'm still really glad that I've done this episode, because we've all learned what chronic illness is, what are some of the challenges of living with a chronic illness, and how psychologists can help those with chronic illness. I truly believe that psychology has a valuable place within physical health, because our physical body and health might generate the symptoms, but it is your psychological processes and your perception of your physical health that will impact your mental health and the psychological side of inflammation and the psychological experiences of illness. Psychology really is more powerful and helpful than any of us could ever know. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know that I did it because it was really interesting to learn about this in more depth and start exploring it in the depth that I really want to. And this is something that I want to look at more in the future. So if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, then please check out Working with Children and Young People, available in all the usual places. And you can get the AI-generated audiobook on selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and selected library systems like Bacon Taylor, Overdrive, and Biblioteca. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World Podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Wiley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at connorwiley.net. So have a great day and I'll see you next time.